last, the public markets might soon see a social networking stock. China's Renren is scheduled to begin trading on the New York Stock Exchange on May 4th. Renren is essentially China's equivalent of Facebook. Let's bring in an expert who knows China as well as the internet in China to talk about this interesting development. Duncan Clark, chairman of BDA China, joins us now from a consulting firm that advises international investors in China. So Renren could be the very first social networking IPO. Thoughts? I mean, are we going to see wild enthusiasm for this?
Well, as a pure play, you're right. This is the most pure social networking company. We could argue, as I think your colleague argued earlier, that Tencent is already touching on to social networking. And Tencent, as we know, is close to a $50 billion cap company. It's the third or fourth largest internet company in the world. So Tencent will try to sort of up its game in social networking. But I think as a pure play, you're right. This is the first opportunity to have effectively a Facebook clone in your portfolio for China.
Talk to us about how Renren fits into the wider social landscape in China. There's also China.flv, there's also Tencent. China.flv is kind of like China's version of Twitter, though. They're not exact, replicas, right?
Yes, and I just heard overnight there's a clone of Twitter called Twitter, so coming from Shanda. So everybody's trying to clone everybody else. And as we know from the movie Social Network, some would argue that Facebook is a clone of another site. Actually, Renren started very much like Facebook and was modeled explicitly on Facebook, coming out of college campuses. It was originally called Xiaonei, and it was a sort of intranet for college students. And it retains that actually element of community so that people can find their lost classmates, like classmates.com in the early days. So that gives the average Renren user a slightly higher profile than the average internet user. As we know, there are close to 500 million internet users in China, but the Renren community is a slightly higher demographic in terms of perhaps income, and it's been very aggressive about pursuing advertising. It's not shy about pursuing advertising. If you go on to Renren.com and other Chinese websites, you will be surprised at the amount of pop-ups. And whereas Facebook's been a bit more discreet, a bit more targeted, Renren's full on exploiting that demographic that it has. We'll see how far it can go, though, because as you mentioned, China.flv, which is really the Chinese Twitter on steroids, is doing extremely well. And in the last 6 months, has blown away all expectations.
Exactly. I mean, Weibo has really exploded. I mean, talk to me about the longevity of Chinese social networking companies. I mean, can you really ensure it in a country like China where, users can just flood in one direction on a whim?
Yes, I think there's a core of users within Renren because of the college origins. And just talking to some users, they'll say, yeah, they may not use it every day, but they'll go back to it because there's sort of an inbuilt intrinsic value of that college community. But in terms of daily breaking news or oh my gosh sort of stuff people want to post, that's increasingly Weibo. So I think Renren has a value. The big question is it going to be at these huge expectations of value that we're seeing right now in this massive flurry of activity to get into China?
How much could a Facebook-Baidu partnership shake things up?
Well, it's interesting. To some extent, Facebook is late to the market, no fault of its own. It's been blocked. So we are seeing this big question now. Is it better as an institutional investor to back a Chinese firm than try to back a U.S. firm to tap into China? And increasingly, it is apparent that it's hard for these companies, either blocked or late or through missteps of their own, like MySpace, to actually compete with local companies on their own turf. This is completely different from Europe, where we see Facebook and Google are very dominant in Europe. But in China, whether it's government restrictions, censorship, or just management mishaps and other things, we think increasingly that it's put your money on the local talent. So Facebook Baidu could be interesting, but partnerships aren't easy. And it raises a lot of issues for Facebook as to how it would operate, even indirectly in China. It's sort of banned if you do and banned if you don't sort of thing. It's going to be a hard act for Facebook to live up to, I think. Expectations are very high for Facebook.
And in terms of censorship, it seems the Chinese government is actually cracking down more, not getting more liberal.
Yes, it's the winter is extending through the spring, summer, fall this year because we have a Chinese leadership transition next year, and that's not into the fall of 2012. So even since Mark Zuckerberg came in December to Beijing on his vacation, things have actually got a lot more difficult. So that's the attraction of having a local partner. But even you can't just outsource all those problems to one partner. Those questions will still remain. How can they act ethically in the interest of appeasing Capitol Hill and the broader sort of community of users of Facebook, for example, globally, who may be sensitive about that. So it's a tough balancing act. And as you've seen that famous map of the world of Facebook, China is just not part of their world. Facebook is dominant in almost every other territory. So this is really a showdown almost between the Chinese government and the world.
And I remember talking to you when YouTube was blocked a few years ago. Then it was Facebook. Then it was Twitter. The social networking scene in China, though, is really exploding. Can the government continue to censor that?
Well, if you look at Sina Weibo and its tremendous success, I mean, there was some risk of Sina actually being blocked about a year after it got going. But it's interesting that I think the government and the Communist Party has actually recognized the value of a social networking site as a means of expressing opinion to a point, and giving some outlets and also the ability to keep an eye on what's happening. So Weibo has been very astute in its government relations, and that's been a big part of its success. So the party in China is not like Egypt with sort of unplugging the internet. I mean, they're a lot more subtle than that. So I think they realize the power of this technology for their good, as well as this supposed, the internet's going to change everything. They don't really buy that. They didn't get that email, or IM, I guess.
All right. Duncan Clark, chairman of BDA China, always great to have your perspective on how the Chinese internet landscape is changing, and we will be watching that Renren IPO coming up in May.